Today is the second part of our series, GenAI Essentials. It's a three-part series and a guide to teaching for an AI future. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Paul Cotter. I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Stukent, and I'm so excited to be your host today. Now, before we dive in, let's get familiar with the chat feature. We want you to use the chat feature today. Go ahead and start out right now. Tell us where you're watching from and where you're teaching. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome, Mary. We're glad to have you with us. Also, as we are doing this today, for those of you who may have missed the first part of this series, don't worry, you can check out this and any others of the recordings for this in our events library. So welcome, Ed from Pennsylvania. Now it's coming in. Marcella from College Station, Texas. Great to have you with us. Yoon from Rhode Island. Julia from Tampa Bay, Florida. It's so great to have each one of you with us today. Thanks for joining us. Now, we also want to remind each of you that we're going to offer you free instructor access to our micro module on AI and marketing. You can also join our waiting list for the brand new GenAI Essentials courseware and Simternship. Now, those are both coming soon, and they're both authored by today's speaker, Christina Kalberg. So this course is designed to give your students a competitive edge in an AI-powered workplace, and it blends ethical considerations with hands-on skills like prompt engineering, bot training, and AI-integrated workflows. And the result is true job-ready AI fluency. So if you want early access to this, or to be on the waiting list, click the link that's on your screen right now, and we'll get you set up with that. Now, what I'd like to do is welcome to the stage Christina Kalberg. Christina excels as an educator in her position as Associate Professor of Marketing at Point Loma Nazarene University, where she teaches principles of marketing, consumer marketing, digital marketing essentials, and content marketing. She is the author of the AI in Marketing micromodule here at Stukent, and her dedication to students and her passion for making a positive impact in the field of marketing earned her the award of Stukent's Professor of the Month. Professor of the Month. So congratulations on that, and welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Paul, and happy Friday to all of my colleagues around the country. It's so exciting every time we get to do this to see the collaboration come together. So thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to focus on ethics, which I know is a big topic. Industry, along with our students and us as educators, we're all trying to figure out how do we use these tools, leverage the power that they have in various fields, but do so in a responsible and ethical way. It's been a hot topic over the last year and a half, and we have some real tangible information to share with you today. I have the distinct privilege of introducing to you my co-speaker today, as well as one of our contributors into the GenAI Essentials courseware. Dr. Martin Jones is unbelievable. He is a friend and a colleague. I actually met him last year at a conference where both of us were speaking on AI, and we immediately connected over this topic of how do we do this ethically, and how do we teach our students to do this ethically. It's so ambiguous, right? Using these tools and how to use them, there is so much cognitive load associated with this topic of GenAI in the first place, but then also trying to very tangibly teach ethics is something that Dr. Jones and I connected over. And that has led us to work together over the last year, and him being a contributor and speaking today. Now, if you don't know Dr. Jones, he is unbelievably experienced. He is such a highly, what am I trying to say? I'm losing my word. You know what? I'm just going to let his bio speak for him. So Dr. Jones is a dual British American citizen. He has a PhD with a research emphasis in ethics, specifically examining postmodern culture emerging from the pandemic. He's also has a Juris Doctorate and was a commercial law attorney in the UK, having been appointed as Solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Wales in 1999. He actually moved into higher education in 2004 as a senior lecturer of business law at Lancashire Law School in the UK and immigrated to the US in 2007 to complete his additional graduate work. He is currently the Associate Dean of the College of Business and Economics, and he is the first professor of AI that I know. But his full title is Professor of AI, Law, and Ethics at Anderson University in South Carolina. He's an early adopter of technology. He's published and presented nationally about the impact of AI on higher education. He's led seminars, workshops, and webinars today. He's actively involved in applied artificial intelligence course design and leads a national faculty forum on the impact of AI in academic that I also sit on. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jones. He is going to share with you his safe ethical framework that he has developed and is included in the GenAI Essentials coursework.
Okay, well, Christina, thank you very much. That was a very flattering introduction. And for all of those of you that are participating today, it's great to be able to connect with you in this way. Let me jump right in with the need, the why are we even talking about ethics? You know, it wasn't too long ago that we were all in this immediate stage of the rollout of publicly available generative AI tools. And we were sort of in the ER of trying to figure out, oh my goodness me, what are these tools? How on earth do we use them? And we sort of came out of that stage into this realization that, okay, digital efficiency, digital fluency, AI fluency, these are all terms that we began to utilize as we began to realize our students and the marketplace was shifting. And the need, therefore, to not only understand what the tools are, but how to use them became really paramount. But we're now again seeing another shift, both in education as well as in the marketplace, because no longer are people talking about what are the tools and how do we use them, but they're now trying to discern the responsible way to put them to use. So it's not just the tool and the usage, it's the responsible usage. And this now opens the door for us to talk about ethics. Here in the United States, we really lack an overall cohesive federal network when it comes to legislative or regulatory access to generative AI tools. We're somewhat behind, actually, competitors over in the European Union, where they have, as of August last year, implemented a very comprehensive piece of legislation, the EU AI Act. But we don't really see that over here. In fact, we've got this sort of piecemeal approach. We've seen two different administrations over the last couple of years take pretty much diametrically opposed views to the potential regulation of artificial intelligence. And then we're also seeing states take their own piecemeal approach to it. So at the forefront of trying to understand how to bring about responsible usage of AI, we've got California or Virginia or Colorado. So all three of those states are really at the spear front of trying to implement some sort of regulatory framework. But then we have others, because we're in a federal framework, we have others that are really doing very different to that. So what this means from our perspective is that we really need to step into the arena of ethics. Because typically when we talk about ethics, we're really referring to self-regulation. when you look at regulation overall or legislation, you can really think of it in two ways. We either self-regulate or we are regulated. Now, most people prefer self-regulation because if we self-regulate, we're able to determine a lot of the standards ourselves. Yet when we are regulated, we're told what to do. So most people prefer to self-regulate. And that's really where this safe framework for artificial intelligence come in, because we are proposing here a voluntary adoption of an ethical code to enable a much more appropriate development, advancement, and usage of generative AI tools in the marketplace today. So the safe framework that I've devised specifically for Stukent and Christina in this up and coming textbook, it's an acronym. So if we're going to self-regulate, if we're going to talk about ethics, it needs to be something that we're able to remember. Otherwise, it all just becomes a little bit superfluous. So the SAFE framework stands for 4 key areas. Now, I'm not suggesting these are the only areas. I'm just proposing that these are 4 key areas for us to bear in mind as we develop tools and as we begin to sort of dip our toes into this huge ocean of water that is ethics. So we're talking about safeguards, accountability, fairness, and empowerment. So Christina, if you wouldn't mind just sort of advancing first of all to the safeguard slide, please. Okay. So go back one. There you go. Okay, super. So safeguards. We might think of safeguards as boundaries. I was actually talking to a group of students at my own institution this morning. I was talking about AI skills, specifically about ethics. And I said, you know, we need to be thinking of boundaries, of safeguards in the same way that, let's say, a farmer might have a fence around a field in which his cattle is placed. In other words, we want to give a lot of freedom, but there has to be some protocols in place to prevent harm. Yeah, you may have heard the old adage that a fence at the top of the cliff is a lot better than an ambulance at the bottom. And that's really what we're talking about here when we present the idea of safeguards. So we want to avoid those that are developing tools, those that are using tools, from straying into dangerous territory. And you may be listening to this right now and you may be tempted to switch off and say, well, hang on a minute, I'm not really developing these tools. So does this really have application to me? And I would say, now, hold on a minute there, because the development of AI tools, this is something that's accessible to all of us right now. In fact, in my institution, we've rolled out a platform to all of our students that enable them to design and develop their own bots with very little external training at all. So when we talk about the development of artificial intelligence tools, we're not at all limiting this to the likes of OpenAI or Anthropic or Google. This impacts us as well. So in terms of safeguards, in terms of these boundaries, as tools are developed, as they're used, we need to be taking into account user privacy. You know, how do we secure data? How are we minimizing the risk to those that are using these tools, not simply for their safety, but, and I think increasingly important, to generate trust and confidence in the tools? You see, this is where we are right now. We're sort of, we're approaching a crossroads where artificial intelligence tools are becoming so commonplace. But the danger is that if we don't have safeguards in place as we're developing and using them, that people are just simply going to move away from them, or they're going to move to what they perceive to be a safer option or an area where they have trust and confidence. So this requires us voluntarily incorporating boundaries into the way that we are developing or teaching those who will develop. So from my perspective, my students, how to utilize these tools. We're talking about a proactive, self-regulatory step that, for instance, let me give you a couple of examples as to what this might look like. What if we were creating tools or training those to utilize these tools in a way that, let's say, gave consumers an opt opt-in strategy for disclosing privacy and personal data rather than just simply an opt-out. Opt-out has been the default for so long now, but it's becoming so difficult to find the appropriate opt-out avenue. So what if we gave them an option to opt-in? What if we minimized the amount of data that was being scraped to preserve confidence? What if we tried to limit bias in our systems? What about contemplating incorporating moral reasoning and moral training into the very design of these systems? Only last year, one of the head of Google's artificial intelligence design, so Iason Gabriel, he came out in a podcast and he said really clearly, look, we have the capability to build moral training into these tools. It's something that we ought to be doing. And as you heard Christina in the introduction, my background's in law, so I'm an attorney. So concepts like agency are second nature to me. Now, the word agency, we sort of associate with AI right now. Does this mean that it's acting on my behalf? And right now, I'm talking about the legal principle of agency. An agent acts on behalf of the principal. An agent, therefore, is under a duty to act in the best interests of the principal. So what if we were developing the tools and training the developers to create artificial intelligence tools that act in the best interests of the user? True agency. Okay, let's advance to accountability. So we've had safeguards. Now, in relation to accountability, I feel that this is a term that we are somewhat familiar with. Accountability means taking responsibility. And that's not just at an organizational and a developmental level, it's also for the individual. So really, there are sort of two prongs to this. There's the training of the developers, but there's also the educating of the users as well, because there needs to be accountability on both sides. But this accountability needs to be so that people understand that responsibility begins with them. Now then, this is where skeptics or cynics of ethics might begin to sort of push back a little and say, hang on a minute, you're talking about voluntary regulation. Can we really expect people to voluntarily regulate themselves through a code of ethics, to voluntarily put themselves in a place of accountability? Well, I would argue yes, and I would argue that we've got several precedents of this enshrined in our development of ethics. So just very, very quickly, if we were to rewind in time back to 1986, the defense industry in the late 70s, early 80s was coming under a lot of criticism from federal government in the wake of several different scandals. Well, the defense industry were able to get themselves together and to self-regulate through the DII, the Defense Industry Initiative of 1986, which imposed this regulatory, this ethical framework that defense industry organizations voluntarily ascribed to, which actually in turn became 1991 federal sentencing guidelines. So the self-regulation of industry was key to developing a federal regulatory framework. But that started with accountability. That started with things like the appointment of ethics officers. Christina introduced me and said, I'm certainly, from my institution's perspective, I'm our first professor of artificial intelligence, but it's not going to be long before we start seeing appointments specifically of AI ethics officers. Organizations are going to very quickly realize just how important ethical regulation is. Again, it goes back to this self-regulation or be regulated. So we need to be considering, as we're developing tools and as we're helping and training others to develop tools, to think about accountability, to think about ethics officers, to take into account AI governance boards, to be bringing in external third parties to audit the algorithms and the coding that we're using as we develop these tools, to be creating traceable practices, procedures, and methods that we're using in developing these tools. Again, this engenders confidence, it engenders trust. It was interesting recently to hear about the importance of watermarking as you know, the latest variants of Sora were released and sort of, you know, pushed out, and then unfortunately it was what I feel it was overnight, and all of a sudden we're hearing about watermark removal apps. Well, you know, we need to be fighting against these sort of developments of apps that are seeking to undermine self-regulation. We need to be thinking about frameworks that very specifically create a system where we are voluntarily holding ourselves accountable, and through which consumers can also have the confidence that they are able to hold these developers accountable. So we've got safeguards, we've got accountability. Thirdly, I believe that we need to take into account fairness. Now, we can use the word fairness. We could also use the word equitable, because that's literally what that means. And here we need to be thinking in terms of overall justice, because not only do we need to train people to utilize these tools, but we need to ensure that the way that they're developed is in a fair, it's in an equitable manner, that as much as possible, we are avoiding bias or discrimination or potentially disproportionate harm. We need to try to create an equitable playing field that really pushes back against even sometimes unintended bias or stereotypes. You know, it was actually only about a month ago that OpenAI released a very interesting report highlighting some of the proportionality studies as to how and who is using ChatGPT. One of the findings of that report was that men in particular tend to be utilizing ChatGPT to ask more technical questions, or to be using chat to answer questions that are more related to the workplace. Women, on the other hand, seem to be using chats, according to OpenAI, in a more social environment and on a larger proportion outside of the workplace. I mean, fascinating information, but with that information, we now need to be careful that if, for instance, there is a disproportionate number of men utilizing, in this case, ChatGPT in the workplace, we don't want an inadvertent stereotype, because remember, chat is trained significantly on user data. So we don't want the training to inadvertently develop an incorrect stereotype. And that would not at all be something that was intentionally included in the coding, but it's something that's permitted because there isn't this overarching fairness. Now then, I'm not at all suggesting that that is OpenAI's intent at all. I'm just giving you that as an example. What's interesting to me as an attorney is that the EU AI Act specifically includes provisions that relate to fairness. So some of the things that we ought to be keeping in mind as we, again, develop these apps, as we select which apps our organizations are going to be used for, as we instruct and train those who are going to be developing them, we need to be thinking about bias audits. You know, the example I just gave you of OpenAI. What are we going to do when we become aware of potential bias and stereotypes, or how can we actually conduct those audits to ensure that there are no disparate outcomes? How can we ensure that our tools are not generating disparate outcomes that perhaps favor one element of the population rather than the other? Or you know, how can we create tools that also serve users with disabilities? I don't know whether anyone has yet realized, but I'm actually wearing Meta's AI Ray-Bans right now. Okay, so I utilize wearable AI. And one of the great advantages with wearable AI is that Meta has designed an app for these glasses called Be My Eyes. So if I was visually impaired, or if a user was visually impaired, you can download the app. And as I'm going about my day-to-day life, I can pair the app with the glasses, and the glasses can actually see for me and can speak to me through these speakers just above my ears. We need to be encouraging increasing development of not just apps and tools, but all kinds of different forms of artificial intelligence interactions that encourage as much as possible fairness and equitable use throughout all kind of users. And so finally, so we've had safeguards, we've had accountability, we've had fairness. The last consideration would be empowerment. Empowerment. This relates to the user. This ensures that I'm sure that you have heard this phrase, the human in the loop. But empowerment is the essential part of the framework that makes sure that AI systems are not only designed, but they're used with the intent of keeping the user, the person, in the driving seat. One of the greatest risks in utilizing generative AI tools is over-reliance, and it's accepting the output. So we put the input into the tools, they give us the output. It's accepting the output without any critical examination. This is something that I speak to my students about continuously, because not only is there the danger of hallucination, but there's the danger that critical thinking itself might be adversely impacted, and we want the user to be empowered. So we need to create tools and train users in a way that promotes user choice and ensures that human oversight is essential. Generative AI ought to serve us as an aid. So I regularly use AI tools as my aides, as my TA, my teaching assistants, because I'm a faculty member. And again, from a European perspective, the EU's AI Act, it specifically ensures that there are human oversight requirements that are built into new tools. And these are considerations that we should always be taking into account so that the human is kept in the loop. I've written a white paper recently, not warning about the dangers of, I don't want to be overly negative. I'm an early embracer of technology, but perhaps just sounding some early alarm bells about some of the considerations that higher education needs to take into account as it looks into the future. And one of the ways that we can potentially try to safeguard some of our programs is to ensure that the human is kept into the loop, is to specifically enable people to be equipped to utilize tools so that it enhances the personal experience, the soft skills. We need to be, for instance, designing user dashboards that promote transparency. I know this is something that Christina has written about extensively in this textbook. We need to also have our interfaces designed in a way that encourages personal verification as well. So all of this to say, it is going to be increasingly important that as we are the designers of an increasing array of artificial intelligence tools, that as we are training not just the current, but the next generation, how to design these tools, that we have to put an overlay of an ethical framework on top of it. And the SAFE framework is one possibility, an easy to remember framework to continually keep in front of us the importance of safeguards, of accountability, of fairness and empowerment issues. Because I'm convinced as we move forward, the future currency, if you will, of artificial intelligence is going to be trust. And in order to gain and retain that, ethics are going to be absolutely paramount. Christina, back to you.
Now you can see why I forgot the word, but I remembered it. Highly regarded. Dr. Jones is highly regarded in this field. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today. I want to sort of bridge webinar 1 to webinar 2. If you recall, if you joined us last month, and if you didn't, that is available to you still. We have it recorded as well as the slides. But last month, I talked about the 7 dimensions of critical thinking. And if you recall, or if you don't, I'll share it with you now. The 7th dimension of critical thinking, which we know is absolutely paramount to ensure that as we in higher education train up the next generation of business professionals in any discipline, that they have that critical thinking skill developed in higher education to offer the marketplace, right? We know that that's incredibly important. The seventh dimension of critical thinking is self-regulation. And so what we've done in the courseware and also with this webinar series is we're now picking up that seventh dimension of critical thinking. And if you remember, when using AI, when we think about it through an ethical lens, a responsible use lens, we really focus on this over-reliance. And one of the things that we have found, those of us educators who have been using various AI tools with our students over the last several years, what we've noticed is that when we teach, when we educate, just as Dr. Jones has said to you today, when we educate them on the responsible and ethical use of these tools, there is less of an over-reliance on the tools and more of a trust in their own human geniusness. And also they understand the limitations of these tools. So let's dive into how do we use the SAFE framework practically for our students. Well, I want to start before we dive into that by sharing this quote, because I share it with my students and I think it's incredibly important. The very own CEO of OpenAI has said, "Why do you trust this piece of technology so much?" Even he can't understand how much we utilize the tool because of all of the errors that we know, bias being a tremendous factor. And so when we teach it in kind of this vein, and we can get our students to understand that we should not blindly trust these tools, we can get them to develop what we call ethical decision making. And so in the courseware, we have actually defined what ethical decision making is. And as we teach our students how to apply the SAFE framework, both academically and professionally, we do it through the lens of ethical decision making, right? And so I'm actually going to share with you a couple of case studies and an assignment that we've created just for you, and some student feedback in terms of how they've actually applied ethical decision making and really, really think through that seventh dimension of critical thinking, which is how can I self-regulate? Because as Martin alluded to, the EU is definitely in the forefront. The US is sort of trying to catch up, but there is no regulation. So we have to take this upon ourselves. And interestingly, our students actually really enjoy it. So the way that we have tangibly been able to apply the SAFE framework through the lens of ethical decision making is we've developed the 4 rules of engagement. So this means before we even open a tool, Chat, Claude, Perplexity, Gemini, whatever it might be, before we open the tool, we need to think through, should we engage with AI for this task, whether academically or professionally? And these rules of engagement sort of give, again, a very tangible and practical application to the SAFE framework. So the first is you need to comply with the policy. And what's ethical decision making? Well, if you don't know what the policy is, you have to go figure that out before you can actually open up ChatGPT and use that tool for that task. Because otherwise you're putting serious liability risk for the company that you're at if you're using tools when they have explicitly said that you're not allowed to. Why? Because they don't want their data put into the open source platform. There's all sorts of reasons why companies say are limiting the engagement of AI tools for specific tasks. And so what we do is teach our students, you need to comply with the policy as rule of engagement number 1. Rule of engagement number 2, this is pretty simple. We think it's intuitive, but it is not, either for our students or in the marketplace. But the second one is we have to be transparent. In the course, where we give all sorts of examples about how you label the use of AI. We have disclosure statements, we have policy statements, we have all sorts of examples in the courseware. But what I teach my students is you need to be transparent because that builds trust. And I model it in my class. So I tell my students when I use a GenAI tool for any part of my classroom. So if I have an exam coming up this week. I'm sure a lot of you have your midterm exams as well. I'm teaching a brand new course material for a consumer behavior class. And so I needed to rewrite my exam for that class. And so I told my students, it's 50 multiple choice true false questions. The human, I wrote the questions. I used GenAI, I use Boodlebox, and I use various tools within Boodlebox. I can use Perplexity, Claude Chat. I like to do that so I'm not over reliant on one tool in and of itself. So I really am a big promoter of Boodlebox. So I use Boodlebox, and I use different GenAI platforms within that account to brainstorm some scenarios, right? So if I wanted to have an advertising scenario to apply consumer behavior theory, I used it to help me come up with what that might be, but I actually wrote the scenario because I didn't like what I was getting. So I wrote it. So I said, I used AI to assist me in idea generation, but the human physically wrote all of the questions. So if you have a problem, come to the human. But I'm real transparent with my students, and I try to model this behavior. If I'm asking them to tell me when they use it, I need to also tell them. I will tell you, I've had a lot of students come up to me just in me doing that over the last couple of semesters, say, you know what? I actually listen to you more and I trust you more in what you're saying because you're so transparent. And then I've had them tell me, I wasn't going to tell you that I was using the tool for this task, but because you've modeled the behavior for me, I felt like I had to. And I love that. It's kind of that self-regulation. And so I want to be involved in that process and make it tangible for my students. The second or the third is human oversight. We know that it's incredibly important. The really great thing about the courseware is we have experts like Dr. Jones, as well as many others, or several others, not many, several others. And so what we have done is we have baked in to any workflow that we talk about in the courseware, we have baked in how to ensure human oversight is in that process of using GenAI, whether you're augmenting a task or you're automating a task, academically or professionally. We actually have shown the workflow and we've shown where you can ensure there is human oversight. One of the rules I use in my classroom for student submission of work is I say, if I can't tell that Ben is the author of this submission, it's too vague and you did not infuse your own human lived experience enough, therefore your grade will suffer because it's too vague. It doesn't really say much of anything. And so in that regard, I've actually been able to help my students infuse that human touch in any of the work that they submit in my class. So that's just one example of how you can do it. And again, I'm going to show you a couple of case studies with how students actually applied this in the real world. And the fourth rule of engagement is you have to verify the accuracy because it's simply not accurate, most of these tools, especially for bias. Dr. Jones had a great example that some image generators are very biased in what they produce. And so if we're using that image from Dolly or from any other GenAI platform, we have to revise that image, or we have to work with the AI to try to get it to where it needs to be because it's not accurately reflecting the population we're trying to reflect with that image that we're getting from it. So we have an entire process for how you do that. I tell my students, I say you have to find at least 2 sources outside of GenAI, typically Google or Google Scholar. Those sources have to have cited the either statistic or factual piece of information, and it needs to be within the last 12 months. That's specific to my content that I teach. You can obviously change that. It could be something that's cited within the last 2 years or maybe the last 5 years is acceptable. But really giving them the specific ways that they can verify accuracy in your class is incredibly important for them, again, to be self-regulated. We use Hosmer ethics at our institution. It's widely used throughout higher education in the US. One of the most basic questions that Hosmer poses to any discipline who's kind of trying to wrap their head around how do we do things ethically is, just because I can doesn't mean I should. So the real question is, just because I can, should I? So just because I can open up ChatGPT to complete this task, should I? And so the more we can get our students to think about this, the more we're applying that seventh dimension of critical thinking, as well as getting them to engage in ethical decision making for whatever task we're providing them. So I thought I'd give you a couple case studies. The first case study I actually have done in my classroom. I've done it both in person classrooms as well as online. It's a great discussion assignment if you teach exclusively online. So I wanted to provide with you a case study that's real flexible and adaptable. This is the first case study. I did write this. You have access to these slides. This case study could be adapted for any course material that you might have. Obviously, you just need to edit it to make it specific for your discipline. So this is Alex, is a senior business major interning at a marketing agency. Alex's supervisor has assigned a specific task and then provided the policy. The policy states that employees are allowed to use AI tools to increase productivity, but they must be transparent, meaning they must cite it. They also have to infuse the human touch. And as a marketing agency, we don't want to be sending out any material to our clients that are inaccurate or that have bias or that are going to get us into a lot of hot water with any kind of online troll, right? So it's really important that we verify any kind of data that we include in a submission of work to a client. The case study goes on to say, Alex decides to use Claude to help with the project assigned by the supervisor. There's 4 ways that Alex decides to use Claude. 1, to do a little bit of research. 2, to create some really dynamic data visualizations. 3 is to draft a competitive analysis report, so writing. And then 4th, to brainstorm strategic recommendations for the client or brainstorm ideas. So Alex makes some modifications to the AI outputs, adds some personal insights that she's learned in her classes at college, and includes additional research from industry reports that she gathered outside of the GenAI platform. So the questions posed to my students were these 5. And what I wanted them to do was I had already taught them the ethical framework, those 4 rules of engagement. And so now here, what I'm saying is please apply the learning that you've gained to these discussion questions for this case study. So here are the 5 questions. I'm going to show you and go through each one and show you the student responses, because I think you might be a little surprised by what the students said. I was, certainly. So let's dive into each discussion question and see what the students said. These are quotes from a couple of different students and sort of what I found to be representative of what the majority of my students have said in response to this discussion question. So the first discussion question is, what specific steps should Alex take to comply with the GenAI policy at the marketing agency that she's conducting this project for? So these were the responses that my students said needs to go find the policy and read it before actually opening up the account, is essentially what my students said. The second discussion question for this case study is, how should Alex disclose? How should she be transparent? So my students said maybe adding a footnote or a citation to the report and letting the client know that this was a human AI assisted report. The third question is, what additional human touch elements might strengthen the authenticity and value of the work that Alex is doing. And so here are the responses here. I loved what the students said. They actually said very much so that there should be this AI human collaboration. And what I realized in reading their responses is they very much so understand that the human should lead the technology, not the reverse, which is in line with what Martin and I both have presented here today. Question number 4, what verification process should Alex go through to make sure that what she's submitting to the client is accurate? Here are the responses. I was happy to see that there were a lot of traditional sources being used in terms of what we do in my field in marketing. So I was really happy to see that the students didn't just say, go open your ChatGPT account and see if they say anything different than Claude. And then 5th, how might transparency about AI use affect the client's perception, right? So really trying to get students to critically think through this. And interestingly enough, I was surprised by the responses I got to question number 5. Most of the students said, I don't think the client's going to be very impressed when they find out the extensive use of AI used to complete this task. They even were able to critically think through that if a client's paying you to do work, you might want to actually use more of the human resources available to you rather than the AI related resources, because the client can just do that themselves. So why are they paying you the money to do it? It was really impressive to see their level of critical thinking. I wanted to offer you up another case study. Oh, that's right. Here were some more responses. So what conversation should the group, so the 5th one was, how might Alex enhance what she's doing? And so here were some additional student responses to this. In fact, one student said I would downplay the use of AI for front-facing client work. The student actually went on to say, if this was a task being done internally, I think AI is a better fit. Here, they were actually utilizing task to fit technology theory, which is another element that I teach and is also in the coursework. Okay. So then I asked question number 6, because I was so impressed with the responses. I said, just because Alex can use AI for this project, should Alex? And the student replies were mixed, interestingly enough. It was actually pretty much split 50-50. A lot said, yes, it's a great time saver. And then there were many who said no. And a lot of it, again, went back to, if this is front-facing work to the public, we need to have a lot more discretion in terms of how much we're using AI to complete that task. So I was really happy to see that. Here is case study example number 2. This is a great one because this directly relates to the students themselves. So I'm going to give this to you in the slides. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to kind of move forward. I'll show you what the case study looks like in the discussion questions, but you have access to this. You can modify it to make it specific to your discipline. I just did this case study with my students in class this semester. I loved it. What I was most impressed with is that, again, when you teach the students the ethical framework that you want them to use, when you share with them what ethical decision-making looks like through those 4 rules of engagement, they are able to take a case study and apply critical thinking, and you'll be really surprised by the answers. Most of my students related to this case study said that they would not have used Carlos's part of the project. They would have, within a short period of time, they would have infused much more of the human touch to get it done. So that was very, it was wonderful to see that. And that was directly from the students. We've created this assignment for you. The slides have this link. You can click right on it, but I thought I'd go ahead and show you what it looks like. So we actually have given a scenario, and then we've given you step-by-step instructions for how you can apply the SAFE framework with this assignment. So you have access to this. And now we've got about 10 minutes left. We're going to open it up to Q&A, and Paul is going to go ahead and lead us through that.
Yes, thank you, both of you, for this great presentation today. So what we want to do right now is just invite anyone who has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can answer those in real time today. While we're waiting for that, I just want to remind you that we are offering that free instructor access to our GenAI in Marketing module that you can use in your classroom and test that out. We also are offering our waiting list for our new GenAI courseware and simulation that is coming soon. All right. Well, any last comments while we're waiting for any questions to come in? There weren't too many questions coming in the chat today, so I think you guys were doing a really good job of explaining what you were talking about. Anything you want to finish up with?
Yeah, I saw in the chat, Jennifer said, when grading research papers, I definitely use AI to validate that it has been a human created document. It confirms transparency. So there are a lot of tools out there that are available to you. I do think whenever you are using AI, I know for my institution, and Martin, I'd love for you to share with the group here today what your institution policy is. I know for us, if you're an educator and you're using AI for any grading, and if a student appeals the grade up to administration, that only using AI for the basis of the grade will not stand, meaning the consequence will not be upheld. The student will actually win the appeal if they appeal the grade. So I would just be very careful and transparent in how you're doing that. If you are using for grading, make sure you check with your institution in terms of how they will uphold any grade that you give in your course when using AI tools to aid you.
I'm going to jump in here. I'd like to answer Todd's question. He's put one in the chat there. He said, which one of the SAFe principles do I think will be the hardest to achieve? That's a great question. The question itself sort of goes back to can we really expect, let's just narrow it down to designers. Can we really expect designers to voluntarily regulate? I think potentially one of the most difficult is actually the first and the second. So my mind's going back as to which is the most challenging between those. But encouraging designers to potentially include safeguards which they think could limit the whatever tool it is they're designing or the accountability. I think just simply requiring those without the educating as to why behind could be challenging. And so I would say with any element of ethics implementation, creating the need is absolutely essential, because at the end of the day, you're requiring buy-in. You're requiring a voluntary buy-in. So even as I'm talking now, Todd, I'm thinking that probably the A would be the most challenging, having people wanting to willingly put themselves in an accountable situation. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. We have another one that says, doesn't Perplexity and/or other AI apps provide sources of content along with content? Is there really a need to investigate the sources further if they're provided by GenAI? I'll tell you, I've used the sources in Perplexity as well as even Google's AI overview. I will tell you about 50% of the time, the information is inaccurate, meaning Perplexity will provide you in their output a statistic, let's take, for instance, and then they'll give you the source for that statistic. When I go look at the source, that statistic is nowhere in there. It hallucinated either the source or the statistic. Same thing happens with Google's AI overview. So I do require my students to take the extra steps whenever providing any kind of statistical or factual information to ensure that it really is accurate.
Beatrice has put an interesting question in here about are there any bodies or institutions in the United States that have attempted to produce some AI policies that we could start considering. Now, if this is from an education perspective, then from an education perspective, there are a number of institutions that are creating policies that will range from, let's say, academic integrity through to what would be acceptable student use. If you're talking about sort of just generally speaking, actually OpenAI on their website has begun creating some, I wouldn't say policy documentation, more along the lines of some best practices that can be quite helpful when trying to think through and develop policies. But this really goes to the heart of the reason behind this seminar and this chapter in Christina's book, because this is, as you go from the actual tools to using them to now learning how to use them responsibly and ethically, this is really sort of the next wave that we're all surfing right now, that we've come to the realization that this is necessary, but there's so little there on a national and a federal level that we have.
Yeah, and if you would like, I put in the chat my email. My AI policy has gone from what my institution provided a couple of years ago, which was a paragraph. My AI policy in my syllabus is now a page long. I actually define what plagiarism is. I define the consequences. I define if they're allowed to use AI for editing, not just writing or tasks. So if anybody is interested, if you would like to see my policy and you can adapt it for yours, I would be more than happy to share that with you. There is not a universal one. It's one of the things that we tried to tackle together, Martin and I, in this particular chapter, to give you as much guidance. We share what's being done around the world, and then specifically in various states, and then also in academic institutions. So sign up for the waiting list, and then you'll have access to that. Martin, I'm going to let you answer this one, but I'm going to pose it to you because this is.
I know I'm seeing it. I'm smiling as I read it, Christine. It's a genius question.
Yes, I love this.
Yeah. And so
what would you suggest?
Yeah, this came up in our opening faculty meeting this semester, and I went in there wearing these glasses to make the point. So short of having an open discussion with students, so the solution actually begins with education. It begins talking about wearable AI devices with students, but it's also most likely going to require each academic institution to create their own policies on wearable AI. Now, there are some like these, so the Meta Ray-Bans that actually have indicators on them. So there you go. You see the little light that's come on now. So that's telling you I'm actually recording this right now. So Meta and Ray-Ban specifically include that and design it into the item, into the glasses, but some don't. So there is no great answer here, I am afraid. And wearable AI is going to replace these.
I'll just say what I do. There's a book called The Opposite of Cheating. It is phenomenal. It's written by two educators, one at UCSD and one at the University of Tulsa. It's called The Opposite of Cheating. And they actually did research on this. Because just like every educator, they were like, oh my gosh, everybody's going to use AI to cheat. And in their research that they published in this book, that what they've shown is that when you teach your students, when there is less ambiguity about how students in your class can use AI, both in the class and outside of the class, there's less cheating that happens. So their whole premise is don't chase cheating, chase learning, because you're always going to have a few that are going to do that. There's always going to be some that are going to try to cheat the system, right? We can't help that. I mean, I had students plagiarizing content long before ChatGPT would write the paper for them. So I've been giving zeros for plagiarism in my classes for 13 years. But I will say this, I had a student use AI on an exam and she failed. She was the only student in the entire class that failed it because it was an open note, open internet exam, but she chose to not do anything, use chat, and she failed it. I loved it. Her grade stood in my class.
Oh, that's a great story, Christina. Christina, Martin, thank you so much for joining us today, and especially for answering these questions at the end. And Christina, I would just add, if you want to send us your policy, we can include that with all the materials so that everyone can just have access to that and everyone doesn't have to email you individually.
I love that. Thank you, Paul.
Yep, we're happy to do that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, for taking time out of your day to learn more about AI. This is number 2 in our series, so please join us for the next one. We look forward to that, and thank you once again to Christina and to Martin for joining us today. Everyone have a great weekend and enjoy. Bye.